We ought to be looking at the pandemic in the rearview mirror now. It should be behind us. It should be over. We should be in the post-mortem phase, asking what happened, how on earth we allowed governments to ride roughshod over our rights. We should be hearing apologies from our elected representatives. But no. Somehow COVID still manages to be in our faces, suffocating us bit by bit and all the time. My children are still required to wear masks at school, all day, every day, rebreathing their own exhaust fumes for hours at a time. In Scotland last week, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said her devolved assembly would spend hundreds of thousands of taxpayers' pounds cutting the bottoms off classroom doors so as to improve airflow in schools. Seriously, that's what she said. Get this, she actually said there's a worry about how much CO2 children are inhaling in improperly ventilated classrooms. They have to keep the masks on so that they exist in a permanent cloud of their own self-generated CO2 held over their mouths and noses like a smothering hand. But rather than let them take off those masks and breathe air like free people should, Sturgeon's proposed solution is to take a saw to the bottom of the classroom doors. To say you couldn't make it up is an insult to made-up things. The fact that you can open a door to increase ventilation on account of its having hinges, the fact that doors exist in schools, at least in part, to inhibit the spread of smoke and flames in the event of fire, significantly more of a threat to the lives of children and staff than COVID ever was, has apparently passed Sturgeon by. But hey-ho, if there's one thing we've learned after 2 years, it's that everything is all and only about COVID. Some days it feels like it always will be. COVID could and should be behind us, as I've already said, but the powers that be keep pulling it back around until it's front and centre. Johnson announced some sort of an end to restrictions, but still that air of lives limited, lives controlled, prevails, like the smirking grin that remains after the Cheshire Cat has otherwise disappeared. And you want to know why? Because after these 2 years, like no others in our history, COVID is all they've got to explain and to justify everything else. Governments need COVID, and desperately. They spent, I think I've got my thumbs right, about £1 gazillion on COVID, all the money we ever had and most of the money we might ever dream of having. They blew the lot on COVID. And since COVID is all the governments have got now, by God they're determined to keep it. COVID, as it turns out, is like a sort of Swiss Army knife, equipped with all sorts of useful little tools for all sorts of jobs, large and small. And meanwhile, the evidence of man-made disaster is all around us. A recently published study from the world-renowned Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore found lockdowns had had little to zero public health benefits and instead imposed enormous economic and social costs. Like we didn't know that already, having been there while it was actually happening. But anyway, let's hear it again. Researchers found lockdowns in Europe and the US lessened the COVID-19 mortality rate by just 0.2%. The authors concluded that lockdown policies are ill-founded and should be rejected in future. Everywhere they were applied, everywhere, lockdowns caused enormous economic and social costs. Allow me to summarise those findings even more. Our governments blew it. Faced with what they told us was the greatest threat to our civilization in our lifetimes, for 100 years or more, our governments took a bad thing and, through overconfidence, monumental incompetence, and with the dull-eyed stubbornness of mules, made it massively worse. More importantly, when they must have known they were making it worse, they did it again and again. Now, rather than take responsibility and own up to their catastrophic failures, maybe say sorry for all the lives ended, lives ruined, lives compromised, a generation of children used like sandbags to protect the vulnerable from a flood, like stab vests worn on the chests of adults. They keep holding up the tattered rags of COVID like the remnants of a curtain to stop us seeing the reality that lies behind it. What lies behind that shabby curtain are consequences, and even now those powers that be don't want us looking at them, far less talking about them, and thereby understanding the crippling reality of them. For one thing, the currencies, and indeed the entire financial model of the West, these have to be bleeding out, turning white prior to falling over completely, I suspect, and lying face first in the dust. It's hardly just COVID to blame for that, of course. COVID was a final nail in the coffin, or some might say a very useful distraction, to say the least. What they did with money, Your money, my money, everybody's money during the pandemic is what the banks have been doing with money for decades now, and it's largely to blame for the bigger mess we're in now. Quantitative easing, they called it, printing money to you and me. For decades, the tactic applied by the banks with governments in cahoots was to print uncountable, unthinkable amounts of money. We don't have any money left. Well, print more then. How much? As much as you like, and keep it coming. I need another super yacht, and so does my mum. No one will notice, and if they do, say it was COVID. Imagine a glass of orange squash, a little bit of concentrate topped up with water. Tastes like orange, you know how it goes. Then imagine tipping that glassful into an empty swimming pool and turning on the taps. By the time the pool is filled up with water, any orange in the mix is so diluted as to be utterly undetectable. That, more or less, is what's happened to our money. The value of our money has been so diluted it's quite literally not worth the paper it's printed on, which probably explains why they don't seem to want to actually print it on paper anymore. They just add more zeros on their computer screens instead. Look at what they did with some of that pretend money. Trillions of pounds worth of debt that will never, ever be repaid. Billions blown on dodgy PPE. Billions handed over as bounce-back loans to companies that didn't even exist. Gone. Those gazillions are gone. And the truly troubling point is that in every way that matters, they didn't really exist in the first place. Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson and the like have the gall to say they've got a way to fix the mess. They might as well try to put out a factory fire by blowing on it. On account of all that funny money, and then their use of COVID as a hammer to flatten business after business, the economic and financial model we've taken for granted for the last 50 years or more is finally done. That Sunak and others claim it's still breathing puts me in mind of Monty Python's Dead Parrot sketch. I took the liberty of examining that economy when I got it home, and I discovered the only reason that it had been sitting on its perch in the first place was that it had been nailed there. It's stiff, bereft of life, kicked the bucket, run down the curtain and joined the bleeding choir invisible. This, as Monty Python might have said, is an ex-economy. Much of Europe is an interesting watch, to say the least. Austria is a police state now in all but name, thanks to COVID. Papers, please. Italy and Germany are much the same. France would likely go the same way, except President Macron is too properly scared of too many of his own people to go all the way to vaccine mandates. Instead, he remains committed to making the lives of the unvaccinated as miserable as possible. In Western Australia, unvaccinated parents are barred from the hospitals where their children lie sick, dying. In Canada, the GoFundMe organisation has withheld millions of dollars raised in good faith in support of the truckers protesting vaccine mandates. What will become of that money, donated by hundreds of thousands of ordinary Canadians, remains unclear. More and more questions are being asked about the vaccines all around the world, questions about efficacy, about safety, and yet governments like the US, Canada and Australia, as well as here and just about everywhere else, continue to dig in, more and more determined to get a needle into every arm on the planet. Israel is beavering away with injection number 4, and the positive cases are spiking in what looks on the graphs like a vertical line pointed into space. With the COVID narrative in tatters now, new weapons of mass distraction are being deployed to stop us thinking too much about the mess. There was a GP on the telly last week saying the stress of lockdown is causing heart attacks and strokes. Well, I never. Climate crisis and environmental meltdown are back to the fore again. Never mind the fact we've dumped trillions of filthy face masks and plastic COVID tests into that environment. That doesn't seem to matter. Millions of Britons face a cost of living crisis. Energy prices soaring, thanks in no small part to successive governments' evangelical pursuit of net zero. I'd like to say don't mention the war, but of course there's Russia and Ukraine to look forward to as well. At least there's the lovely, lovely Olympics in China, thanks to dear old Xi Jinping, who kindly made all the masks and PPE. Shh, don't mention the Uyghurs, and definitely don't mention the lab in China, where, according to more and more scientists, at least the virus started. And before anyone says all lives matter, let's remember to forget about the uncounted thousands of Africans and others treated no better than slaves who died building the stadiums for the World Cup in Qatar that our fittest and finest are heading to. Quick, somebody talk about COVID. Weapons of mass destruction or not, there will be no hiding the fuel bills due in a few weeks' time. People forced to choose between eating and heating tend to behave differently than before. Energy black hole, net zero and its consequences, and only pretend money with which to pay for it all. How much longer can our dear leaders hide behind COVID? We do a lot of weather forecasting on this channel. I tell you this, there's a storm coming.